Welcome to this edition of CTQ's Incite Your Month. Remember that each month we kick off with a 5-minute collection of ideas, books, articles, something from our curiosity diet for you. Harish, the pandemic age has still not left us. So tell me about a book that you've been reading on this topic.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting book called The Age of the Pandemics. This has been written by Chinmay Tumbe, who's an assistant professor at IIM Ahmedabad. He had written a book earlier about migration. The title of the book is India Moving. And it was a fascinating account, and during the lockdown, he just got enthused to go out and write a book about the pandemic. The most interesting thing about this book and what he brings to your attention is the demographic disaster that the four pandemics were. And India was at the epicenter of all of these four pandemics, right? The cholera, the plague, and the influenza. And we just don't talk about those pandemics. He says it's like talking about the 20th century without mentioning the world wars. The impact was such. The reason for that is also that there isn't a lot of visual evidence of the pandemic, unlike other disasters like the flood or an earthquake or war, affects only humans or in some cases animals as well. So actually you don't see a lot of visual evidence of buildings destroyed and things like that. What happened in the 14th century in Europe was that the plague actually became part of their artwork and a lot of literature. So it was there in the people's consciousness, whereas for us it was almost wiped out. So there's no collective memory of the pandemic, which is why we make the same mistakes again and again. In fact, the book talks about somebody writing in 1960s or 1959 that looks like we've forgotten all the lessons from what happened in 1918. Imagine if the next pandemic is to hit India in say 2070 or 2080, all these people who are taking the decisions now would have retired, and all these kids will only remember about their Zoom school classes and not know what to do about the pandemic. So that was a great eye opener for me, something that I had not read about or I had not known back then.
Yeah, when you mentioned something that is commemorated in art, even a nursery rhyme by Garinga Rose is a reference to the plague. And so, this collective lack of memory that you speak about, we have noticed this in our work when it comes to culture building and stories, that a lot of it is just forgotten very easily. And when you're in the midst of that escalation, that bug fix, that weekend that everyone pulled together, and in a year's time, you just can't remember anything of that. So, it just struck me that it may not be as severe as a pandemic, but finding some way to keep that collective memory alive, I think, is a fairly interesting point that I learned from this. So, with that, let's go to our article for the month. Apart from the pandemic, a lot of conversation in business circles has been this idea of hybrid work. It comes from the A16Z new publication called Future, and the article is called Hybrid Anxiety and Hybrid Optimism, the Near Future of Work. So, this is an article by Rajiv Ayyangar, and a nice classification of remote 1.0 all the way till 3.0. And he talks about how 1.0 was about these crazy companies pioneering asynchronous work using a lot of writing based culture. And then we are now perhaps headed into 3.0, where we'll have this curious mix of sync and async work. And the other interesting thing that he talks about is how the future will be, or the world will be multiplayer. It borrows this from the world of gaming, where we all want to collaborate, we all want to know more about each other, but in a digital sense. And it's not completely going to be asynchronous. That's a big claim that he makes. So, anything that you noticed when you read the article?
In fact, continuing with the gaming world, he also talks about something like Discord, where you're just hanging out. Discord, as people would know, has been primarily about gamers and it has been about gaming. But again, the technological platform and tool is something which is becoming more and more mainstream now. So I think there's a lot to learn from that world. If you think about the characteristics, these are people who are engrossed, single person in one house, but having this community sense of kinship with people from all over the world. They're part of these teams, they're playing together, they need to know each other, trust each other when they're playing those shooting games and stuff like that. That is what you want in a corporate environment as well.
It doesn't have to be 9 to 5. There doesn't have to be a
Yes.
strict model where only you can build trust. You can build trust in other ways.
Right.
Some days you may not be doing anything like that. So
Correct.
I think there's a lot for us to learn from gaming and this world. We've talked about the pandemic, we talked about hybrid work. Tell me about the book summary that we have chosen for this edition.
So this is a very interesting book called How to Future. Future being used as a verb itself was very interesting. So the book actually talks about how to think of these various futures. So it is not about forecasting. Forecasting is putting your eggs all in one basket and saying this is how things are going to pan out, and you put your reputation at stake. Most of the times you're not there to see the forecast actually falling flat on its face, but usually forecasts go wrong. Uh, Humans or individuals and corporates should not, in my opinion, be thinking about forecasts, but actually be thinking about multiple futures, because there's always a probability assigned to each of those futures of what is going to pan out, and some part of it may actually hold true, but not a lot may actually happen. So how do you deal with all of that? Which is why you need to think about different futures and do that kind of scenario planning. So this book gives a very instructive framework on how to think about these different futures and how to collect signals from various sources and use what they call as the steep framework, which is think about the social, the technological, economic, environmental, and the political aspects of whatever you are trying to look at, and create those multiple futures that you can think of, and have some plans about what you're going to do depending on what future is going to actually happen.
Yeah, like we have said in our manifesto on Future Relevance, which is on our Choose to Think website, it's not really about predictions, but it is about possibilities. And preparing for different possibilities is the way to go, because none of us can predict the future. And Harish, I've been taking a course on thinking about the future. Maybe we'll talk about it some other day, but I saw a lot of resonance from this book and that course. So, from this, let's go to a smartcast of the month, and someone who has been thinking about the future, but also being very conscious about the present. So, what's your pick for the smartcast of our month?
Yeah, with Vinita Gera, who's the general manager, India COE at Dell Technologies. This is a really fascinating smartcast. Vinita spoke about how she has upleveled herself. She spoke about upleveling the site as well for Dell, and we covered everything from why should an individual contributor switch to an engineering manager kind of a role, what are the right reasons to do it, what are not the right reasons to do that switch. We also spoke about diversity and inclusion. She's co-written, co-authored an article sometime back last year on the International Women's Day on what engineering women really want, and we were just trying to see whether the past 1 year has actually changed any of this. So I thought it was very about her playbook on what she does when she ends up taking a new leadership role. And we also did this whole exercise on the user manual for Vinita, what can get the best out of her. So that was very interesting.
And I think a lot of people listening to us may be considering a management track, and this episode should help them reflect a little bit on that. In fact, we have a couple of other episodes on engineering and especially women in engineering roles.
Right.
There is one episode we did with someone called as Smriti. We do encourage you to check some of those episodes out as well. So, management is going under a lot of changes, and these people are at the forefront of that. All right, Harish, let's pick a podcast for this month. And this recommendation comes from our colleague Sanasi. So, Sanasi has recommended a podcast called the Huberman Lab. This is a podcast by Dr. Andrew Huberman. He's a Stanford professor on neurobiology and ophthalmology, which is an interesting combination, I think, because there is so much of processing that happens behind the eye. And his podcast is something that she recently discovered and told us about. And she finds it very fascinating, the discussions and conversations about the brain and how it affects our behavior and health. So, the episode that she called out was on productivity and how do you maximize that and your health, both physical and mental, and on a daily basis, which is something that we are also interested in. We are not interested in these grand schemes. Give us something that you can do on a day to day basis. Very fascinating episode. One thing that I enjoyed listening to was about how do you do that kind of deep work that we have heard many people like Cal Newport talk about, because all of us want that satisfaction of having gone really deep into a task and having produced or shipped something at the end of it. And one tip that Dr. Huberman gives is that there are these slots in the day when you are likely to be at your most energetic, and something that we have heard of before. Specific recommendation, which is that schedule this task, say for something like a 90-minute deep work exercise. Schedule it for about 3 to 4 hours after you wake up. And he explains the science behind why. So apparently, let's say you get up at 7 o'clock typically every day, which means that about a couple of hours before that, your temperature is at a minimum. Your body has gone into this rest state and is now emerging out of that rest state. So, by certain calculations, they say that about 6 hours after that is when you are starting to hit your peak. So, that's when you should be scheduling. So, if you are a 7 o'clock riser, we should be recording episode like this by 11. It's a very simple tip. And I think this podcast is a very interesting one for people who like to geek out in all these science based self improvement tips.
Yeah, some of these things that we've been reading about and listening to have actually opened up our eyes to a lot of these things, like why managing your energy rather than your timetable is so important. Another thing that I remember you pointing out to me the first time back in 2016 or 17 was about the gut, how important the role of the gut is in impacting everything from emotions to decision making to general health. So some of these things very small have a larger than expected impact on us. We just need to be more cognizant of these things and then design our life around it.
Since we spoke about tips, let's close with a quick tip from Choose to Think on compounding habits. As part of our compounds, we help people read every day, be active on social media every day. And last week, someone wrote in saying that I've been struggling to maintain my reading. I just keep forgetting and it just isn't happening. So, do you have any advice for us? What we reminded them was that habits are really hostages to triggers. It's not as if you built a habit, it will just stay there, because that inciting incident in your day which sets your habit going remains very important every day that you get up. So it's very easy to forget to read, even if you enjoy reading. So all that we told this person was that why don't you set up a alarm? Could be very old fashioned. Just set that clock alarm or a phone alarm to remind you of your reading slot, and that will do the trick. And this has worked time and again for all our subscribers over the years. In fact, we jokingly asked them to hire a rooster for the first couple of months if needed, but it just tells you that even small things like that can have outside returns.
Yeah, and I hope this Incite Your Month videos and mails that we send out do the same for inciting curiosity among our audience for the whole month.
On that note, thanks Harish. We'll see our viewers and listeners next month.